December 26, 1944. 4:50 p.m., the phone rang in Omar Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg City. The voice on the other end was crackling with static, but unmistakable. "Brad, we're through." Bastogne is relieved. Bradley stood frozen, receiver pressed against his ear. 7 days ago, he had watched George Patton promise the impossible in a freezing conference room. 7 days ago, every Allied commander, except one, had called it madness. Now Patton's tanks were rolling into Bastogne. The 101st Airborne had been surrounded for a week. German panzers had them in a death grip. Ammunition was nearly gone. Medical supplies exhausted. The coldest winter in decades was killing men as efficiently as bullets. And Patton had just turned an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of a blizzard and smashed through German lines like they were made of paper. Bradley set down the phone. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from the realization that he had just witnessed something historians would argue about for the next century. The impossible had just happened. December 18, 1944. 2 days earlier, Bradley sat in his headquarters, staring at reconnaissance reports that made no sense. For 48 hours, German forces had been pouring through the Ardennes forest. The forest Allied intelligence swore was impenetrable to major offensive operations. Over 200,000 German troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, they had smashed into the thinly held American the 8th Corps sector like a sledgehammer through glass. Some American divisions simply disintegrated. Others fought desperately while retreating westward, blood staining the snow. Bradley picked up the phone and called 3rd Army headquarters. "George, there's trouble up north. Big trouble." Patton's voice came back excited, almost cheerful. "Brad, I've got a bridgehead across the Saar. I'm on my way into Germany. Everything's going exactly according to plan." "Wait a minute," Bradley interrupted. "I need your 10th Armored Division. I need it now." The line went silent for 3 seconds. When Patton spoke again, his voice had changed completely. "You're pulling me out, Brad. I'm about to break through. Everything we've fought for. Eisenhower wants all senior commanders at Verdun tomorrow morning. Emergency conference. This is bigger." He had just ordered his most aggressive commander to abandon a successful offensive and prepare for something unprecedented, something that might not even be possible. That night, while Bradley wrestled with mounting casualty reports, Patton did something that would change everything. He called in his staff, all of them. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, was already waiting. "The Germans have launched a major offensive through the Ardennes," Patton told the assembled officers. "Eisenhower wants us at Verdun tomorrow. I suspect we're going to be ordered north." His staff exchanged nervous glances. 3rd Army was facing east and south. Over 250,000 men, 13,000 vehicles, all pointed in the wrong direction. "Start planning," Patton ordered. "I want 3 contingency plans. First, an attack north with 3 divisions. Second, with 4 divisions. Third, with 6 divisions. Have them ready by morning." His chief of staff spoke carefully. "General, turning the entire army 90 degrees in winter conditions." That's exactly what we're going to do," Patton cut him off. "Get to work." Throughout that night, 3rd Army staff officers worked in barely heated rooms with maps spread across tables. They calculated fuel requirements. They plotted road networks through terrain most had never seen. They drafted movement orders for an operation that shouldn't be possible. The logistics were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had to disengage from active combat, turn 90 degrees, and attack into completely different terrain. In the worst winter in nearly 4 decades, while maintaining combat effectiveness, one officer looked up from his calculations and said quietly, "Sir, even if we move perfectly, the Germans will have time to reinforce their positions south of Bastogne. We'll be attacking uphill into prepared defenses." Patton didn't even look up from his map. "Then we won't move perfectly. We'll move fast." December 19, 1944, 11 a.m. Verdun, France. The conference room in the Caserne Magina was colder than a meat locker. 16 senior Allied commanders sat bundled in heavy coats, breath-forming clouds in the frozen air. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower called the meeting to order. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster." The words hung in the frozen air like an accusation. Disaster was exactly what it looked like. German forces had driven a massive bulge into Allied lines. American casualties were catastrophic. Communications were shattered. Units were scattered across frozen forests. But Eisenhower pressed on. The town of Bastogne must be held. The 101st Airborne is surrounded there, along with elements of the 10th Armored. We must relieve them before they're overrun. He turned to face the room. His eyes settled on Patton. "George, how soon can you attack north with a substantial force?" Patton stood up. He walked to the situation map with the confidence of a man who had already won the battle in his mind. "I can attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd, 48 hours from now." The room exploded. British officers laughed out loud. American commanders shook their heads. Montgomery muttered something about typical American exaggeration. Even Bradley felt his stomach drop. "George," someone said loudly, "that's impossible." Patton turned to face the room. His voice was ice. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division, attacking from the Ardennes area. Objective: break through to Bastogne and relieve the 101st. Eisenhower studied Patton's face carefully. "When can you start? Really start?" "The morning of December 22nd, Patton repeated without hesitation. "My staff has the movement orders ready. We attack in 48 hours. Bradley's chief of staff leaned over and whispered, "He's bluffing. There's no possible way." But Bradley knew better. He had known Patton since West Point, known him through decades of service. Patton didn't bluff about combat operations. If he said 48 hours, he meant 48 hours. "George," Bradley said carefully, choosing his words like a man defusing a bomb, "that's a tall order." Patton's response was vintage Patton. "We'll do it. My men are already standing by for execution." Montgomery spoke up then, his British accent cutting through the tension. "I can launch my counteroffensive from the north, not before January 1st. I need time to properly organize mass forces, ensure adequate logistics. 2 weeks versus 48 hours, methodical British caution versus American aggression." The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Eisenhower made his decision. Patton attacks on the 22nd. Montgomery, prepare your northern counteroffensive for early January. As the conference broke up, Bradley pulled Patton aside. His face was tight with concern. "George, you better deliver on this. The whole Allied command structure just heard you promise the impossible." Patton's reply was simple, deadly serious. "I'll be in Bastogne by Christmas." What followed was one of the most remarkable military movements in history. Third Army had to disengage from active combat operations, turn 90 degrees to attack into prepared German defenses. All while the worst winter in living memory tried to kill them. The movement began immediately. On icy roads barely wide enough for a single vehicle, entire divisions began their pivot north. The 4th Armored Division led the way. Behind them came the 26th Infantry, then the 80th Infantry. Over 130,000 vehicles competed for road space. The cold was inhuman. Temperatures plunged below zero. Snow mixed with freezing rain created ice sheets on every road. Soldiers who had been fighting in relatively dry conditions to the south now faced the full Arctic fury of the Ardennes winter. Tank engines froze solid. Mechanics worked with bare hands on metal that burned like fire. Fuel lines crystallized, tires shredded on ice. Men urinated on engine blocks trying to thaw frozen steel. The Third Army kept moving. Unit commanders understood that speed mattered more than perfection. Getting forces into action quickly was better than waiting to arrange everything ideally. Patton had drilled that into them through months of combat. On the morning of December 21st, all 3 divisions were in positions south of Bastogne. They had covered distances ranging from 75 to over 150 miles in 48 to 72 hours, exactly as Patton had promised. Bradley, monitoring the movement from his headquarters, was stunned. He had doubted whether Patton could deliver. Now Third Army forces were positioned to attack on schedule despite challenges that should have made the operation impossible. German intelligence intercepted American radio traffic about the movement. One German general wrote in his diary, "The reports cannot be accurate. No army can move that fast in these conditions. American intelligence must be feeding us false information." But it wasn't false, and on December 22nd, Patton's forces attacked northward. The 4th Armored Division led the assault. Their objective was simple. On paper, impossible in execution. Drive north through heavily defended German positions. Break through to Bastogne. Relieve the 101st Airborne. The fighting was immediately savage. German forces, surprised by the speed of American response, had nonetheless positioned strong defenses south of Bastogne. They knew relieving the garrison would undermine their entire offensive. They were prepared to fight to the death to prevent it. Weather continued to savage both sides. Fog reduced visibility to yards. Snow turned battlefields into white nightmares, where friend and enemy were indistinguishable until you were close enough to die. Artillery struggled to support attacks while displacing forward through frozen mud. Tank battles erupted on icy roads where maneuver was nearly impossible. Sherman tanks fought German Panthers and Tigers at point-blank range. Villages became fortresses where every building had to be cleared room by room. German counterattacks struck American flanks repeatedly. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards, sometimes less, but Third Army didn't stop. They attacked, advanced, attacked again. The momentum Patton had built never broke. Inside Bastogne, the situation grew desperate. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the besieged garrison with grim humor and iron will. When German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum on December 22nd, McAuliffe's one-word response became legendary: nuts. But legendary responses didn't solve practical problems. Ammunition dwindled. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded men lay in frozen cellars without morphine. The German noose tightened. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared. Allied air power, grounded for days, struck German positions with devastating fury. Hundreds of C-47 transport aircraft dropped supplies to the Bastogne garrison. Paratroopers rushed into open fields under German fire to retrieve containers of ammunition and medical supplies, but relief still depended on Patton's advance, and Patton was still 4 miles away, fighting for every frozen yard. December 26, 1944, 3 p.m., Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding Combat Command B of the 4th Armored Division, received his final orders: break through to Bastogne, regardless of cost. Today, Abrams was a tanker's tanker. Aggressive, skilled, absolutely fearless. His soldiers would follow him into hell if he asked. Today, he was asking. He organized a task force around Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion. Sherman tanks, infantry and half-tracks, supporting vehicles. The plan was simple and insane. Charge straight up the road from Eisenhower to Bastogne. For miles through whatever German forces stood in the way, at 3 p.m., the attack began. American tanks roared forward in column formation, guns blazing. German forces, caught by the sheer audacity of the assault, responded with anti-tank fire and small arms. Shells ricocheted off Sherman armor. Men died in their vehicles. The American column kept moving. Tanks fired on the move, suppressing German positions. Infantry cleared houses. The road behind them filled with burning vehicles and bodies. The column ahead never slowed. At 4:50 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead tank Cobra King, approached Bastogne's perimeter. He stood in his turret hatch, waving an orange identification panel. Soldiers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, manning foxholes and frozen ground, saw American tanks approaching from the south. They had been relieved. 7 days of siege. 7 days of fighting off German attacks. 7 days of wondering if help would ever come. It had come, and it wore Patton's Third Army patch. When Bradley received confirmation that Patton's forces had broken through to Bastogne, his reaction was complex. Pride, mixed with relief, mixed with pure amazement at what had been accomplished. He picked up the phone immediately. "George, congratulations, you did it." Patton's response was pure Patton. The 101st didn't need rescuing, Brad. They were doing fine. We just opened the door so they could continue the fight. Bradley smiled, despite himself. Trust Patton to claim credit while giving it away simultaneously. But Bradley knew the truth. Without Third Army's relief, the Bastogne garrison would have eventually been overrun. Ammunition was exhausted. Medical supplies gone. The siege couldn't have continued. In his personal notes that night, Bradley wrote something he would later expand in his memoirs. "George did it better and faster than I had any right to expect. He turned a whole army on a dime and delivered exactly what he promised." Days later, after the immediate crisis passed, Bradley pulled Patton aside at a medal ceremony in Bastogne. The conversation was private, but Patton recorded it in his diary. "Brad told me the Third Army's response was the most brilliant operation of the war," Patton wrote. He said historians would study it for generations. Coming from Bradley, who was not given to hyperbole or excessive praise, those words carried enormous weight. As 12th Army Group Commander, Bradley had oversight of every American ground operation in Europe. Every campaign from Normandy to the German border. For him to call Bastogne the most brilliant operation of the war reflected genuine professional admiration. Years later, long after the guns fell silent, Bradley reflected more deeply on Patton's achievement at Bastogne. In his memoir, A Soldier's Story, he wrote with unusual emotion. Patton's finest hour came in that brilliant response to the German breakthrough. He turned a whole army on a dime, drove it through terrible weather into desperate combat, and delivered precisely what he promised. The relief of Bastogne became one of the war's most celebrated episodes. It demonstrated American resilience, tactical flexibility, and the critical importance of aggressive leadership. For Bradley, it validated his controversial decision to keep Patton in command, despite repeated scandals and political pressure to remove him. For Patton, it was redemption. After the slapping incidents in Sicily, after months of exile and public disgrace, he had proven his value beyond any doubt. He had accomplished something no other Allied commander could have done. Turned an entire army 90 degrees in winter conditions, and broken through to a besieged garrison in 7 days. The 101st Airborne's defense and 3rd Army's relief operation proved that American forces could match Germany's best troops in the hardest conditions imaginable. It showed that speed and aggression could overcome superior defensive positions. It demonstrated that the supposedly cautious, inexperienced American army could execute complex operations with a speed and efficiency that stunned friend and enemy alike. Bradley and Patton's relationship was always complex. Old friends, professional rivals, commanders with completely different styles and temperaments. But at Bastogne, all those complications fell away. Patton had delivered. Bradley had trusted him to deliver. And together, they had achieved something remarkable. When reporters asked Bradley years later what he remembered most about the Battle of the Bulge, his answer was immediate. Patton's relief of Bastogne, that was the moment I knew with absolute certainty we were going to win the war. If this deep dive into one of World War II's most dramatic military operations fascinated you, then you need to subscribe to this channel immediately. We bring you the untold stories from history's greatest conflicts, revealing the moments when impossible became reality through courage, leadership, and sheer determination. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next video. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about the moments when ordinary men achieved the extraordinary against impossible odds.